Eurofighter? I hardly even know her. Nah, that sucked. She Euro on my fighter till I Typhoon? Geez, sorry, let me just... The Eurofighter Typhoon, distant cousin to everyone's favourite pallet jack, the Eurolifter. Join me as I build Hasegawa's superb rendition of the Eurocanard. I mean, come on, it has Euro in the name! This build, in a shock revelation that will surprise and prostrate you, started with the cockpit. Given that this is a Hasegawa kit not tooled in the magical year of 1988, you'd expect it to be completely flat, but shockingly, there's a little bit of raised detail. But we'll get to that a bit later, because I have world's most tedious observation to make first. The Eurofighter's cockpit, from what I can gather, is Dark Admiralty Grey, which can be approximated to Federal Standard 36231. This Federal Standard code is what the instructions call out. If you've done any amount of research into US fighter jet cockpit colours, that string of numbers probably sounds really familiar because that's the same colours what the Americans use. Despite this, literally every other Hasegawa kit I've built thus far has called out quote-unquote aircraft grey, a colour that only exists in the Mr. Colour range of paints, is in complete and utter pig to match to any other paint range, and sort of only vaguely looks like 36231 in the sense that it's grey. Why they call out aircraft grey instead of the actual colour that they're very evidently aware exists, I don't know. I just thought it was funny. Anyways, as I was saying, the cockpit has a bit of raised detail, and while it's not 100% accurate or whatever, it's decent, to the point where I don't think the cockpit decals really do it justice, because they're black and white and just a bit boring looking, so I did the scale modelling equivalent of self-flagellation and tried to pick out all the little knobs and dials by hand. I don't have any footage of actually doing it, so please accept this footage of me trying and failing to use a toothpick to do it instead. I did end up using some of the decals, but only the ones that I absolutely needed to. After all that was squared away though, all that remained was to give a few bits a bit of a dry brush and put it all together. It doesn't look too bad just as long as you're about 10 meters away and squinting, and I bet someone else more competent than me could probably do a bit better. Moving on to general construction, and it was actually pretty dang good. Everything fits together generally quite well without any major gaps to speak of. Getting the two fuselage halves together is a bit of a faff because pretty much everything on the bottom half of the plane ends up being a part of the wing's subassembly, so if you're not already in the habit of gluing everything little by little in sections, you will be very quickly after this one. The vertical stabilizer is pretty much a butt joint though. Instead of the tried and true hole and tab or multiple holes and pegs or designing it into the fuselage halves or literally anything, you just sort of put it on and pray. Boy, I hope someone got fired for that blunder. I think this kit might have one of the most complicated air intakes of any 72nd scale jet I've built, in the sense that it's made up of 4 pieces, but it's actually designed quite well, such that you can assemble half of it, fill in any gaps caused by the middle splitter thingy, and then paint and glue it without much trouble. I think the air intake is the main source of complaints I've heard regarding this kit, but honestly I ended up having a lot more trouble with the wings if anything else. Despite my best efforts, there was a hairline gap running across the wing root, although even then it's not much of an issue because of how small it is and because there isn't any panel line or rivet detail running across it. When all was said and done though, all the seams were very small and took only a few seconds with the 400 grit to sort out, and any gaps were small enough to just be mostly hidden with some Vallejo putty. Any build where I don't have to crack out the Mr. White putty is a good one, and it meant that before long I could chuck some primer on. I was genuinely worried that there was going to be some massive glaring issue that I missed, and that it would take days of work to fix, but nah, after priming it, it actually looked pretty damn good to me. While I was waiting for all that to cure, I worked on the exhaust and the things under wings. In a shocking display of benevolence by Hasegawa, they straight up include an entire European's weapon set, meaning that for air-to-air you get AIM-120 AMRAAMs, AIM-132 ASRAAMs, IRIS-Ts, and Meteor missiles. And for air-to-ground, you've got Brimstones, Alarms, Storm Shadows, and Tauruses. They all have decals, and they've given you some example loadouts in the instructions too. This is something that I really wish they did more often, because even though it probably pushed the price of the kit up a little bit, as I've mentioned a few times before, If you can't find any of the weapon sets locally, your only options are to either import them from somewhere and spend an amount so ludicrous that it would honestly be more productive to just buy aftermarket resin, or do without, neither of which are particularly ideal. After that, I moved on to the landing gears. They are literally fine. They are by far some of the landing gears I have ever made. They're not particularly fiddly, and they can support the weight of the model. I literally do not have anything else to say about them, so let's move on to something more exciting. While I was looking at some reference photos, I noticed that there are some rather noticeable rivets on the wings and vertical stabilizer, so after drawing some templates, link in the description, I got the comically overpriced pizza cutter out and went to town. I tried to do it the traditional way where you measure and mark everything out by hand, but I couldn't for the life of me get it right and decided to do it the troll physics ass way of just riveting over the template. They ended up being incredibly soft and did not at all show through on the final thing, but I reckon it's mainly down to the unbelievably hard and brittle Hasegawa plastic, and absolutely nothing else. Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which, after that, I could finally move on to painting. The instructions recommend FS36375 for RAF Typhoons, and while it's probably close enough, I decided to go the extra 1.6 kilometers and get a bottle of what AK purports to be a match for the BS626 camouflage grey used on the real things. So you know what I was saying last video about how it's a single colour and how it would take effort and skill to mess up? Well... This is very evidently not up to the standard I've set for myself, so expect an apology video in a few days. Regardless of how quickly this build turned into a gigantic tour de farce, however, Mama didn't raise no bitch ass quitter, so I had no other choice but to forge on, apply gloss, and put the decals on. This kit comes with 3 schemes in the box. First is ZJ921 of the RAF, during its time in No. 3 Squadron. From what I can gather, it saw a bit of action in Libya, dropping at least one Paveway 4 in support of Operation Alamy in 2011. It would later be transferred to No. 6 Squadron, possibly around 2019ish or so, I really can't tell. And then, in May of this year, it was retired to be used as parts as part of the RAF's Reduce to Produce program. The second is 3030 from the Luftwaffe's 74th Fighter Wing. They are responsible for maintaining quick reaction alert covering the southern bits of Germany, meaning that it's fairly easy to find photos of this plane with live IRIS-Ts under its wings. Isn't that neat? I doubt this plane, or any other German Eurofighters really, would ever have to use them though, because as we all know, nothing ever happens. Lastly, and the one I went with, ZJ930 of the RAF's No. 17 Squadron. From 2005 up until 2013, they served as the RAF's Typhoon Operational Evaluation Unit, meaning that while they may not have seen any action, there's an unbelievably narrow but still non-zero chance that this plane has carried a loadout similar to the one I've depicted in my model. Except psych, no there isn't, because the Storm Shadow and Brimstone were only integrated in 2017 as part of Project Centurion. That's right, baby, this kit was 5 years ahead of its time. Can't river count me about it because I've already river counted myself. The decals were about as you'd expect from Hasegawa, meaning that they're really quite well printed but are painfully thick. The sheet is wicked big, and for the most part it doesn't present much of a challenge. That is, except for the bloody stepped off of this line lines on the wings, which don't sit the way the instructions say they should and are generally a bit of a pig to work with. But with a bit more patience and a few more brain cells than me, it realistically shouldn't be a massive deal. Now, usually I, gloss over the whole gloss varnish thing, but I recently bought a bottle of AK's Gauzy Agent and oh my god, it's so good. You can use it straight out of the bottle, it self-levels excellently, and it really does give the model a nice shine. Compared to Vallejo's gloss varnish, which in my experience is either only too thick or too thin, with any in between being so unbelievably narrow that it might as well not exist, this is much easier to work with. AK, please sponsor. Anyways, after that, I covered the model in oil. I already have a dedicated video detailing how I do all my oil paint tomfoolery, so watch that if you want to learn more, because apart from skipping the color modulation step because I don't know enough color theory to know what would go well with grey, it's pretty much just that. For some reason, I found that my oil paints didn't blend quite so well this time, making my quote-unquote pre-shading look a bit shit, but I guess it's a sign that I should probably move on from this set that I bought nearly a year ago for the princely sum of $3. That said, Eurofighters do generally tend to get pretty grimy, so I still come out on top anyways. Everything's coming up hellfire. After a coat of satin varnish, I very quickly did a final bit of weathering. The staining caused by the APU exhaust was done with just a bit of black pastel, and some burnt umber oil paint was used to create some streaks on the underside. Compared to the Rafale, I didn't use any white spirits when streaking the paint back, and I felt that this effect was much more controllable and generally came out better this way. But really, after all that was left was to glue everything that needed to be glued in place, and thus, I could finally call my build of Hasegawa's Eurofighter Typhoon complete. Unlike the two previous Euro canards I've made, you've actually got a few options if you want to build a Typhoon in 72nd scale. The issue is that a lot of them kind of suck. From what I can tell, this kit is more or less the cream of the crop. It goes together pretty nicely and gives you all the options you could ever want. It's maybe ever so slightly lacking in detail, but in typical Hasegawa fashion, it's good enough, and is more than made up for by the superb shape accuracy in my opinion. Really, the only issue is that it's not quite so readily available, in Australia at least. The easiest way to get it would be importing it from Japan, and with how batshit insane shipping is, it'll probably cost you around $60, which seems to be around, if not slightly lower, than what it would cost you if you can find it locally. I saw an aviation museum selling it for $80 once, which is kinda taking the piss, but otherwise, I generally do think that $60 is pretty reasonable for what it is. I mean, it could always be worse. It could be Revell's laughably terrible Rapid Pacific boxing, which comes with an Edward photo etch set, a book, and costs $200 dues. On the other end of the spectrum, Revell's 2004 tooling seems to be pretty competitive with Hasegawa's option, being slightly less detailed in some areas, more detailed in others, as well as giving you quite a few more options in terms of decal schemes. Otherwise though, I personally really wouldn't consider Italeri or Hobby Boss's offerings worth your time at all, and Airfix's new starter set may or may not be good, but it's not out yet, so I don't know. In a way, it's kinda pathetic that the best Eurofighter in 72nd scale isn't even European.